very warm afternoon from us here in Harare. Thank you very much for joining us to another great show, hopefully another great show on Friday Drinks. We've got the usual Rufaro Shumba here with us, and we've got a guest who seems to understand what's actually happening. We don't know what we're talking about, but we've got somebody who's actually on the streets everywhere. He knows the rates, he knows what's actually happening, and we're, it's bound to be a wonderful conversation, and I'm looking forward to it. John is here, but before we get to John, maybe we can go through what we're actually drinking. We don't have Zesa, we're using solar, so that has restricted what we're actually having. But
yes, somebody couldn't have their beloved heated shrub juice, and
disappointed.
Has had to.
I have to make do with Zoe and soda, water. But it's okay.
It is what it is.
It is what it is.
Yeah. On this end of the table, as always, we're having much more interesting beverages. And I chose this Johnny Walker because, George is always making fun of this brand. He associates it with dealers and traders. And
we have one in the house.
and JB is a banker and trader. And, it's so this is one of the better ones from the house of Johnny Walker. Mm-hmm. And interestingly, the Johnny Walker, the business was actually a grocer, and he used to just buy whiskeys from different distilleries and blend them and then market them. So but he did so well that Johnny Walker is the best-selling whiskey in the world.
So his name is actually Walker.
Yeah, Johnny Walker. It's called Johnny Walker and Sons.
Unfortunate.
So, JB, I hope you enjoy it.
Thanks.
Is this your go-to whiskey?
Actually not, but it's for you for today. Thanks. Cheers.
Okay. John, it's been a minute.
Yes, it has.
Maybe you can start off by just telling us what you've been up to.
Okay, thanks, Tinashe. Thanks, guys, for inviting me. Good afternoon, everyone. I think it's easier for me to tell you what I haven't been up to than tell you what I've been up to. Been getting my fingers in all sorts of pies, but the main thing I've been working on is a commodity fund, which is an agricultural-based commodity fund that we're setting up specifically to take care of post-harvest issues to do with agriculture. See, about a year ago, we realized that farmers had stopped by growing food crops, preferring the cash crops like tobacco and cotton, only because there was an organized exchange for that or market for it. Mm-hmm. So we then sat down with a couple of stakeholders and came up with a commodity fund that will essentially provide liquidity on the Zimbabwean Mercantile Exchange, ZMX, and will hopefully entice farmers to go back to the fields and come back to the market through ZMX to sell their wares. In the same vein, again, after engaging stakeholders, we realized that the offtake of commodities, especially those for processing into other food crops, had struggled with funding mechanisms on how they could acquire products without overstretching their cash flows. So typically, you would find that an agro-processor might require, for instance, 10,000 tons of maize a year, but can only afford to procure 1,000 tons of maize per year. So the funding gap there was traditionally funded by the banks, and when interest rates went up last year and later on this year, that option became unviable. So after sitting with them, they said, okay guys, can you put in a mechanism where you drip feed us the product, but with us knowing that the product has been procured and secured. So we as a fund will procure product in bulk and then feed the market through forward contracts. And as we develop that forward contract market, we'll then standardize them and come up with futures that can also be traded on the exchange.
Okay. And how is the prices? How are they determined?
So it's pretty market determined. The way ZMX
Are you saying that GMB won't be involved?
Okay, so last year as we were engaging stakeholders, including the Ministries of Agriculture and Finance, we did manage to get them to relax the rules around commodities. So the SIs at the time would stipulate that farmers had to sell, especially the strategic grains, which is maize, sorghum, soybeans, and barley and wheat, only to GMB, and the price was set at GMB level. Okay, but that was since relaxed initially in December last year, And I think it's been officially announced this year that farmers can sell their product to anyone, except for those that have been funded by the Presidential Input Scheme. So our mechanism is really there to create that price determination. So a farmer will come onto ZMX with a parcel and say, I want X amount of dollars for it, and we will assist, along with other players, of course, to determine a price that everyone is comfortable with.
Sounds very interesting. All the best, eh?
Thank you.
And hopefully in the next coming months you will let us know how it's progressing.
Absolutely.
But sounds very interesting. It sounds like the innovative things that we actually need in this market.
Thanks.
So well done on that. But that's not the reason why we got you here. The reason why we got you here is because over the last 3 months or so, we've seen the power market rate go haywire. We've seen the official rate moving in tandem. We've seen prices spiraling out of control. We've seen all sorts of things happening in our Forex market. And I think that our audience, as well as us, we actually just trying to understand what is actually happening.
Okay.
Could you just, speaking to the 6-year-old, could you tell us exactly why the rate moves from 950 at the beginning of the year to about 4,000 we hear now before we even get to June?
Okay. I think first of all, you've got to understand that currency, especially in Zimbabwe, the US dollar is in itself a commodity. And that's driven in terms of pricing by supply and demand. So if there's a huge supply of it in the market, the price tends to either stabilize or even go down, which has never happened in Zimbabwe. Or if there's a shortage, the same thing happens, then you'll find that the price, which is the exchange rate, also moves in tandem. But that movement is not driven just by sentiment, it's driven by actual trades. So for currency to move, it means that there's something pushing it. In our case, it's liquidity in the market in the form of RTGS. So whenever there's an influx of RTGS in the market, you'll find that exchange rates also move in tandem. And I think the Minister of Finance did very well over the past couple of years in terms of managing that and controlling the liquidity in the markets. But lately, there has been quite an influx of RTGS into the market, and as a result, the rate has started moving.
Okay, all right. Thanks for that. In this session, what we will try to do is to be a little more pedantic than what you obviously get out there, so that we also understand. I think John spoke about supply and demand, so we all agree that US dollar is a commodity and it's driven by supply and demand. So let's look at the supply and demand. In 2022, we received 11.6 billion US dollars coming in. That's the supply, right? So, and when you look at our requirements, are you actually saying that we are importing more than the 11.6? The 11.6 is not enough.
We're certainly importing more than the 11.6 because we're not manufacturing as a country at the moment. A lot of the commodities that we procure, be they fixed goods or inputs, are imported from abroad. So the demand for currency will always be there. And until that changes, where we either export a lot more than we import, but right now we're import dependent, and therefore the demand for currency is always high, regardless of how much currency we've received.
I have a different take. I think that this idea that there's a shortage is a misnomer. Shortages only occur when there's something wrong with your price discovery. So if our foreign currency was priced appropriately, if there was equilibrium between supply and demand, we would not be speaking about there being more demand than supply. Because, so let me just use an example of rates. At the official rate, which is always at a significant discount to the power market rate, it creates an arbitrage, an artificial demand for currency. And that's why you have a power market in the first instance, and that's why we have this appearance of there being much more demand than there should be. If it was priced properly, consumption of imported goods would actually fall because people can only import people will be able to import much less if the price is higher. So the problem is not that there's a shortage of currency or that we're not getting enough in exports. It's that we have a market that we call the auction that artificially prices the Zim dollar.
So what you're actually saying is the auction actually stimulates import demand.
Absolutely.
All right. Okay. So in tandem with that, if we look at 2022 with what Rufara said, when we compare 2021 and 2022, we see that in 2021, we only imported 6.9 billion worth of goods. But in 2022, we imported $8.6 billion. In tandem with what you're saying.
Absolutely.
Actually, without the auction, perhaps the imports would have been somewhere around 7 billion or even less, because we still had the auction in 2021. So if we look at from the supply side, the 11.6 that's actually coming in.
Sorry, Tinashe, before you move on, I think you also need to factor in something that everyone seems to have forgotten, especially when you're looking at 2021 figures, which was the COVID impact on economies. Okay. So a lot of the economies were virtually closed because of COVID in 2020, and 2021 was really a recovery period. So that import figure there is slightly understated because industry was still coming back into line.
Okay. So would you say $8.6 billion is what we're importing, and that's roundabout what we should be importing? Or according to Rufaro, there's a lot of stimulated demand in there that shouldn't be there. If the auction priced the commodity US dollar properly, it would not be 8.6. At least that's what Rufaro is arguing. No, and I tend to buy that argument.
I totally agree with the price distortion and what they do to demand for foreign currency. But for me, the question then is that money acquired at the auctions all going to imports?
Fantastic. You've actually just made us go into the next question, which is a good thing, which is the auction. When we look at the auction and we look at 2022, we look at they only allocated $1 billion. So we are actually importing 8.6 billion officially. We probably import more than that, right? Some of our imports do not exactly pass through the border correctly. They jump the border. But if we look at the auction only accounts for about $1 billion. So it means that there's $7.5 billion that we are importing using the official channels. That has nothing to do with the auction rate.
Correct. And remember, and again, it's an argument that even government has put forward, is the fact that the economy is largely dollarized to some extent, and a lot of the importers are selling their products in US dollars anyways. So that money is finding its way back outside to bring in more. That probably may explain that gap.
Okay. The other thing in 2022 that we did is loan proceeds. So it seems like Zimbabwe is borrowing quite a bit from offshore. We borrowed $1 billion from offshore in 2022. And I would assume that what then happens is the next year, the interest payments or even principal repayments. Do you think that it's a factor in the supply of currency in Zimbabwe?
No, I don't think how much we're borrowing moves the needle. If you look at the last time we were 100% dollarized economy, the loan books of the banks were about 4 billion. So 1 billion is actually a much smaller percentage of what we've seen in terms of borrowing previously. So it speaks to the informal sector being a cash economy, and those imports are driven by what's happening on the informal sector. And I think there's a lot of commodities like gold that are smuggled out, and the proceeds of those sales outside the country then come through as imports as well.
Yeah. So that's an important intervention there. And I want the audience to be, please stay with us. We're saying that we have 11.6 billion US dollars, and we're importing 8.6 billion dollars, right? But what Rufaro is saying is, as far as remittances are concerned, that's about 1.6 billion. It never finds itself in the formal sector. So this is money that goes directly into the informal sector. So from the 11.6, we take away 1.6, we're now at $10 billion. And from the $10 billion, we look at remittances, NGO remittances, it's about $1 billion, about $1.1 billion. And a lot of that comes in kind. Doesn't come in as hard cash, comes in as drugs or whatever it is.
For sure.
So from 10, we're now on 9. And then from 9, from what you're saying around loan proceeds, we take away the 9, we're already at $8 billion that we can work with. And from the $8 billion, we're actually importing 8.6. This is officially.
Yes.
So already we have a gap, right? And we're talking about in the official market. The problem then happens, and this is what, John, I want you to speak to, is when I sell my house and I want my money outside of the country.
That's illegal, Tinashe. Why would you want that?
That's the point I'm trying to make. That obviously it's not going through the formal channels. But I'm still competing for currency that's out there in the market. Can you tell us of the, maybe let's not call it black market, but the informal demand for currency? How much of it do you think is in our economy?
I think the demand for currency in the informal sector is much higher than in the formal sector. Why? Because basically, if you look at groceries, for instance, in the informal sector, and what we call the matak shops, which is downtown Harare, they're all sold in US dollars.
So they are not part of that 8.5?
They're not part of that figure. There's also a figure that you've left there, which is the diaspora remittances, which is quite huge. I think according to Reserve Bank figures,
1.6
about $1.6 billion. Okay, that is also fueling the informal sector quite a bit, because that is where our black market guys really get their money from. So it's not by coincidence that you find them near the money transfer agencies, along Kwame Nkrumah and so forth, simply because that's where the money is coming from.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you explain to us, there are moments when the exchange rate is not moving, and then there are moments when it goes crazy. What would have happened? Are people's salaries changing every week?
Okay, there's a source of RTGS that comes from somewhere.
Where is it coming from?
Your guess is as good as mine, but there's RTGS.
I can tell you where
that
it's coming
always
from.
finds its way in the market, and every time, and you know for sure that whenever certain events happen, especially the movement in the exchange rate, there's a lot of RTGS.
All right, maybe you don't want to speak to what's happening currently, but you were very much involved in banking during Gona's years.
Yeah.
Can you speak to what used to happen, when they used to mint money in the night shift, and then in the morning you have bags of cash coming out of 80 Samora Machel and going and buying a commodity?
Indeed, the colloquial term for money in Zimbabwe now has become bag or beg. Rather.
Beg.
Yeah.
All right. Is that where it comes from?
That's where the term comes from.
All right. Did
So
you know that?
basically,
No, I didn't.
it came from the fact that you could literally, and this is a fact, go to the Reserve Bank and get a bag. Okay. And that bag would find its way into the streets to buy currency.
All right.
But the bag was a $7 bag.
All right.
Yeah. So, and not to say that the same thing is happening. I have no evidence of that. But
Well, we're not using bags of cash for sure.
perhaps the bags
We're a
have
bit more
become
sophisticated.
digital. I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. But just explain that further. So these bags would find their way on the streets, and then they would pick up this commodity. And then what then happens? It goes back to the central bank as US dollars. And what would they do with that US dollars?
I have no idea what they did with it. But the fact of the matter is that Zimbabwe needs currency as a whole, whether it's public or private sector, for whatever requirements that they have, right? So, I mean, the common belief in the street, again, don't quote me directly, was that it did go back to the central bank to buy what was required then. If you remember when the central bank tried to feed the whole nation through something called the Bakosi and stuff, which was basically groceries that were given to people for free. That had to be funded from somewhere. And the bulk of those groceries were imported groceries.
Okay.
So one is forced to think that that's exactly what the money was used for then.
So the quasi-fiscal activity. Rufara, I want you to speak to this. Why is the central bank involved in allocating currency, in picking up currency in Mozambique, and then it goes back and they pay for electricity. They do all these things that ordinarily Treasury should be doing. Why are they doing it? Or why were they doing it then? We're not saying they're doing it now, Governor, but why were they doing it during Gono's time?
Look, I think what hasn't changed between Gono's time and today, and I think it's a philosophical issue, where they look at free markets with suspicion. They think that the business community, the private sector, is given to profiteering, to manipulating the market for their benefit. So they believe they should put their thumb on the scale, manage things, control things. And that's not intrinsically a bad thing. There are markets where the exchange rate is managed, like the Chinese renminbi is a managed exchange rate, and they manage it quite well. They don't have foreign currency challenges over there. I think our problem here has been the way we have executed on the managed exchange rate. So all the problems in terms of the that led to a power market actually coming into existence, where the excess demand that was not met through official channels ended up on this power market, and all the volatility and wild swings that we see there is because of the way we have failed to manage the official exchange rate efficiently.
Rovar, I'm going to push back a bit there. If we think about it, every November we go through this ritual that's called a national budget, and we actually do our allocations, and we say even our subsidies. So even from Budza or Zupco, whatever it is, we allocate something. And we say this is, as far as our revenues, this is what we're collecting, and we've allocated the subsidies. So why is the Reserve Bank, certainly during Gono's time, why were they printing more dollars to pick up in the market to fund government expenditure, if everything had already been allocated in the fiscal framework?
So I think that's the, so the point I'm trying to make is the quality of the execution of managing allocation. This is where the problem is, where there was no discipline. We always ended up spending more than we had said we were going to spend, running these huge deficits, and then instead of actually going into the market and making the case that, look, we've got this funding gap, let's try and raise money through treasury bills. And the way most normal governments go about funding their deficits, we just increased money supply. And even if you actually read the previous governor's book, their mindset was that the way everybody else does it is bookish. It doesn't quite work for us. We are unique. We're different. The rules don't work.
John, would you like to come in there? Do you agree?
Yeah, I agree on two fronts. First of all, the printing of money is not a new phenomenon in Zimbabwe. It's happened all over the world. This is what broke Germany way back. Yeah. If you remember, the history books would show pictures of people pushing money in wheelbarrows. It was pretty much their version of bag. Also, you'll find that running an economy on more than one currency is a problem in itself. Okay, in the sense that normally the Reserve Bank would fund, like Rufara has alluded to, its operations through the issuance of treasury bills, for instance, right? But for you to be able to issue treasury bills, it means that there's money in the banking sector to draw those treasury bills.
Or it is from revenue from Zimra.
Or revenue from Zimra, but mostly through banking deposits, savings from people, right? So the banks will have excess liquidity, and then they'll bid for treasury bills, right?
Yeah.
But there's no money in the banks in terms of savings. The only money you find in the banks are just transactional accounts that are coming in and out of the bank. So there's no time for banks to buy TVs anymore, really. Okay. So that leaves government with no option in terms of how do we then fund our activities? How do we draw liquidity from the markets? Because it's never there.
So you're saying the problem is the financial services system doesn't have savings, and we've got $2 billion we're told that's under our mattress, the National Mattress Bank.
Yeah.
And it's not in the banking system. So if the banking system was a safe haven, what you're arguing is the $2 billion would have funded government expenditure.
Absolutely. And people have lost trust in the banking sector. People lost millions and millions of dollars.
John, why are you not the governor of the central bank? Because you figured it out.
I don't think I've figured it out yet. I just, I've been following events since then quite keenly because I was here. I've never left the country since, I was here during the thick of things in 2008 in the banking sector. Right. And I was in awe of what was happening. It was crazy, And when I see what's happening now, I can't help but feel like I've watched this movie before. I think we are slowly but surely getting back to that sort of level.
Yeah, I think JB touched on something quite interesting, which is one of the challenges that we have is we have not just a managed foreign currency exchange rate, we have managed interest rates. So, and the managed interest rate that we have in real terms is negative. So if you have Zim dollars in a bank account earning interest, basically every 3 to 6 months you're just losing your purchasing power, material amounts of your purchasing power. So the reason why there aren't savings for the banks to use to buy TBs is because the depositor is wise to the fact that the interest rates are negative in real terms. So, and that's the reason why the bank balances are transitory. People don't just place their money in a bank and forget about it. And so we've got this distortion with foreign currency, and we have this distortion with Zim dollar interest rates as well. If we actually had free market interest rates and depositors had confidence that by operation of a real interest rate, 3 months from now, 6 months from now, next year, 3 years from now, their Zim dollars would have the same purchasing power. They would not be under pressure to get rid of them and buy currency on the power market or BRICS or whatever it is that they feel ring fences their Zim dollars from inflation and devaluation. So we have two important policy distortions. One is foreign currency, the other is interest rates, and that's why Zim dollars are transitory.
Okay, so I would add the third one, which I would want us to look at, which is ZIMRA revenue, that we actually don't have enough revenue. So when you look at ZIMRA revenue, last year, they collected $2 trillion in 2022.
What does that mean?
Yeah. So you have the benefit that, I don't sleep at night. So what I did was to recalculate what that actually means in US dollar terms.
Okay,
so that
fantastic.
It makes sense for people
otherwise it's gibberish.
Yes. So the gibberish $2 trillion actually translate to, if we use the official exchange rate over the year per quarter, I calculated it per quarter, it comes to about 4.8 billion US dollars. So this is when you're using the official exchange rate. But when you're using the power market exchange rate, it comes down to about 3.5 billion US dollars.
Okay.
Right. So that's how much we're collecting. So what I'm trying to add to the conversation is you've got exchange rate distortion, you've got interest rate distortion, and you've got revenue expenditure distortion, where we're only collecting 3.5 effective dollars, but we're spending closer to $7 billion, which the $7 billion would not have been a problem if the interest rate structure was proper, because then the dollars would be in the financial services sector, and then you would use that, you would borrow from the financial services sector, from savers, and then fund that gap.
Absolutely.
But because we're not collecting, and because people like Rufaro have now been hardened because of what happened in 2008, people are keeping their money under their mattresses. An interesting fact around this is, what then should we do from what you learned from 2008?
I think the lesson should be drawn from what happened post 2009, where basically, first of all, we need to be honest with ourselves and accept the fact that the Zim dollar, if anything, just distorts things even worse. It's something that we don't have the discipline to manage ourselves, and therefore when it's at our disposal, we tend to abuse it, and this is the result where we are today. So, and you'll find between 2009 and about 2013 thereabouts, the dollarization of the economy performed wonders. I mean, there was stability from an inflation perspective. That's when we saw a recovery of things like manufacturing. There were inflows through FDI, etc., etc. Yes, it's a bitter pill to swallow, but it worked.
The banking sector actually expanded to about 4 billion, US dollars, but at some point it didn't work.
At what point is that, really? I think it's not working is not an opinion shared by everyone. The point where it started failing was really driven by pressures that had very little to do with the broader economy, but more to do with certain fiscal requirements that needed to be met. Okay, namely the payment of civil servant salaries and so forth. Okay, which would have required a streamlining of the civil service, perhaps, and other disciplinary measures to spend within our means.
I want to explore that a little bit further because I think it's very important for us to understand how dollarization, quote unquote, failed. So I don't think dollarization actually failed. I think what we did is we simply moved away from dollarization. So what do I mean by that? So between 2009 and 2013, the banks had to manage their depositors' liquidity in terms of actual physical cash and money in nostrils. And the banks that failed actually, that's the reason why they failed, because they didn't manage this well. But when it was left to the bankers, for the most part, they actually managed this really well. And if you had $100 US dollar bank balance, you could actually withdraw $100 US dollars. You could actually wire that money out of the country. What then happened post 2013 is that the central bank took over this management of the cash and of the nostro. And that's when the ratio...
The RTGS system.
Yes, the RTGS system. That's when those bank balances stopped being US dollar balances. They became faint US dollar currencies. It was a local currency with a fixed exchange rate to the US dollar. And over time, because of indiscipline on the part of the central bank, the ratio of 1-to-1 became unsustainable. And eventually this currency became a local currency. So that's what happened. If we actually move back to 100% US dollar system where we let the banks manage their balance sheets, we are not going to have any issues.
Okay. All right. So that brings us nicely to what I want us to talk about, which is what happened in Egypt. Because what then happened post the GNU years is we accumulated debt, legacy debt and other types of debt. And now we're trying to clear that debt. And we're having quite a bit of a problem there. And, we've had teams in Harare. And then we had a special day that was dedicated to Zimbabwe, a round table. And what came out of that, and this is a very interesting one that came out from, and I will read verbatim here what it says. This is the U.S. Assistant Secretary of Treasury, Eric Mayer. And he says that they will only support Zimbabwe as far as Zidera is concerned. So they are not going to finance anything in Zimbabwe except or only after Zidera conditions have been met. And Zidera conditions have to do with human rights and rule of law. What say you?
So look, I think, it's the Americans have their prerogative. In terms of who they will support financially and why and how. And obviously, given the current state of affairs, we're not going to unlock any capital from them. But we have friends who have capital, like the South Africans, like the Chinese, who don't feel as strongly about the status quo, politically anyway.
But we are heavily indebted. So for us to access new capital,
I understand. So
any new creditor will look at your indebtedness.
I hear you. The point that I'm trying to make is, if our fiscal house was in order, we would be able to raise capital from South Africa or from the Chinese, from people who have the cash, who are not as who don't care as much about the issues that are in Zidera. The reason why we are not raising money is not. I want to push back on this idea that Zimbabwe can't raise capital because of certain political issues. No, the primary reason why we are not able to raise capital on global financial markets is because our fiscal house is not in order. If we put it in order, there are institutions and countries that would merely give us capital.
Even though you're indebted?
Yes.
Okay, so you're saying, okay, let me ask the banker.
Yeah, sure.
Right? So someone is already heavily indebted, but they're fiscally responsible. Would you give them more debt?
Yes, I think in banking we call it restructuring of debt. Okay.
But then you haven't restructured the debt.
Yeah, so the point that Rufaro was making is very relevant, in that for the Americans, it's expedient for them to throw Zidera at the problem and say, yeah, it's only because of your human rights and so forth, okay? Because they don't want to spend time explaining about the fiscal disciplines that are bedeviling the country. They're simply saying Zidera. And unfortunately, Zidera is also really a perception issue. I must say this, the one thing that the current government has been good at is, if anything, attempting to address those Zidera issues, right? The rule of law in Zimbabwe is not as bad as it was before, right? We don't have random policemen standing in street corners telling you that you don't have a wheel spanner and therefore there's a fine of so much or a bribe anymore, right? Violence, political violence, yes, there's still some here and there, but it's far less than it was back in the Mugabe era, and anyone can testify to that, okay? Attempts at addressing issues to do with reparations for farmers, etc., there talks in the background, and it's public information. So they are trying to address the Zidera issues, okay? But it also...
The Americans don't think so. In fact, the Americans are very clear that the act binds us in opposing lending to Zimbabwe from international financial institutions until definitely certain criteria under Zidera is met.
I think efforts are underway, okay? They're not complete, right? The other thing, it speaks to what's happening right now globally, or rather in Africa and developing nations, the whole BRICS argument, right? Where I think the world is taking a look at America and the British and their dominance in the world, especially from a funding perspective, right? And the sentiment, I think, around the world is that perhaps we should be looking elsewhere.
My argument, and I disagree vehemently with both of you, my argument is the country is already indebted. It doesn't matter. There's no one who's going to look at Zimbabwe with fresh eyes if we haven't sorted our indebtedness. So when you look at credit, any credit committee, when you're ticking the boxes, it doesn't matter whether it's Chinese or Turkish or Iraqi, wherever in the world, even in Russia, we can't tick certain boxes because we're heavily indebted. That's why everything, to unlock that new capital that you're talking about, hinges upon our debt clearance. Because if we do that, we clear our arrears, then yes, we may not borrow from the Americans, we'll be able to borrow from the Chinese. But I ask you, why would you go and borrow from the Chinese or, for example, Afreximbank, where you're borrowing at interest rates of around 12, 14%, when you can borrow from the World Bank at an interest rate of 2%? Just because you don't want to meet the Zidera human rights
But before we even go into the price of new debt, let's just be clear. If we put a compelling case on the table, we could get a check from China for 25 billion and pay off all our, not just our arrears, but all our foreign debt, right? The reason why that hasn't happened has got nothing to do with politics. It's simply because we haven't put a compelling case on the table to make it make sense for them to write us a check of that size. And so that's on us from a just fiscal discipline perspective. The reason why we haven't been able to get this money from the South Africans, from the Chinese or Brazil or the other guys in the BRICS is because we haven't presented a compelling case. And I believe that we actually have everything that we need to present such a compelling case. We're just not putting
Actually, we did with Afreximbank, and we got $1.6 billion. Look at where that got us.
Wasn't enough.
And how did we behave with the?
It wasn't enough, unfortunately.
Why is Afreximbank building a new HQ in Zimbabwe? I mean, they will obviously say politically correct things that they're groundbreaking, but the reality is that they were owed money that they just couldn't get out, and they decided that, you know what, let's spend some of it over there and build something that we can see and touch, because that's how bad we are as a debtor. And I think if we improve our behavior as a debtor, notwithstanding the perception of the politics, we will actually be able to do much better in terms of raising money. And this is so. And there's another aspect of this that's quite interesting as well. So we're talking about national debt in terms of the government of Zimbabwe's debt, right? But the other place that we are failing is in the private sector, where because of the overhang, right? Because our country has investment status of junk.
We're not even rated.
Yeah, that's junk basically, right?
No, junk is rated.
Okay, so we're worse than junk, right?
Yes.
So that also affects the private sector, because you might actually be running an export-facing business that is growing year over year, that has hard currency cash flows that allow it to raise money on global capital markets. But it's just because of the overhang, because this business is in Zimbabwe, it just makes it that much harder for the private sector to raise meaningful amounts of capital. So if we actually sorted out our arrears in terms of the government's position, you probably find the private sector would immediately be able to raise 10, 20, 30 billion dollars. So it's a really big deal. It's a huge albatross on the neck of the Zimbabwean economy, these arrears.
Okay, thanks for that. Let's move forward. And the next thing that I want us to talk about is something that, the markets now are reading every word that the president says, quite keen. Last Sunday, he came, seething, and very bombastic language was used in the Sunday Mail. We understand that even more bombastic language will be used in the next Sunday installment. But let's just focus on, what government is saying on what they term price madness that's happening with our retailers and everybody in the formal sector. And this is what they say. It says government, whose responsibility it is to protect the consumer and ensure stability, will take all measures necessary, including painful ones if need be, to ensure price stability. Business, this is the president speaking directly to the business, was seemingly squandering government's goodwill, privileges, and incentives to profiteer, and in some instances, illicitly transferring money beyond our borders for stashing. So the president, that's last week Sunday, came out very strongly against the spiraling prices, saying that it's business that actually is profiteering. What's your view on what the president is actually saying? Is this correct when you look at the markets?
Look, my view is, yes, he's largely right and justified to feel the way he feels. Absolutely, there's been a lot of indiscipline within business. But the question is really, is it so difficult to identify who those culprits are and deal with them decisively? We feel his pain, but I think it's also fair to name and shame those people who are on the wrong side. But there's also something that's in the same article that perhaps you haven't picked up, where he's basically asking why people who are getting money at the auction and allowed to retain their import proceeds and to sell in currency locally are still going back to the auction, right?
The auction is not enough. the auction limits what you can get to 500,000. And if you're one of the big manufacturers, that's a drop in the ocean. And as we've noted from the numbers, we import about $8.5 billion. This is in the official channels. The auction does not barely touch.
Precisely. So those are some of the answers that should be given when he makes those questions.
Okay.
So that maybe you fully understand.
So I have a different take.
Rufaro, I want you to speak to what business actually says, because he's speaking to what government said. But this is interesting. This is what business actually said. And business says, well, hold on a minute. It's not us. Somebody's creating hot money, which entails speculative capital flows, which move very quickly in and out of markets as economic agents seek high profit, consequently leading to market instability. So businesses come out very strong and say, actually, it's not us. It's because there's somebody who's creating hot money. When the auction worked, prices were stable. But the minute you started creating hot money, we all know what happens.
Yeah, look, I have empathy for what I think that's the CZI president.
Yes.
Is saying. But I also have some opprobrium for the business community in general, because depending on the sector and how whether the policy is good to them or bad to them, there's a lot of selective outrage. We don't have a overarching voice as business that speaks to what works better for the the macroeconomics and the business community. So I think there's a problem there, and also we don't enjoy trust as a business community from the government. They view us with suspicion. They have this idea that we're engaged in profiteering, and I think as much as that perception is not accurate, the business community is also to some extent culpable over the last 10-20 years for not engaging and building bridges, so that when they speak and make a point, it's not viewed as something coming from a community with a nefarious agenda, but a legitimate concern about what is and isn't working.
But Rufaro, beyond the political rhetoric, which I think you're going down a rabbit hole of rhetoric rather than hardcore facts. Let's stick to the facts. What business is saying and what the importers are saying is the entire retail sector is governed by an auction rate that only releases, if we're honest, less than $1 billion. And yet officially we're importing $8.6 billion. Why should the auction rate determine market prices? It's barely scratching the surface. It's actually making the distortion, because what these importers are having to do is to subsidize the auction with what they get from the open market. So you're getting 90%.
Supplement, not subsidize.
Yeah, supplement. You're getting 90% of your currency from the open market and getting 10% from the auction, but you're having to sell at the auction price and not the market price.
No, I agree 100% with the way you've characterized it. I think obviously we're not having an honest conversation here between government and business. And so if you look at it from government's perspective, one of the things in my analysis of the events over the last week or two, including the speech, that I think is important, is to separate between what has been said by the policymakers and what they've actually done. So previously, when the rate has run like this, you've had this policy action from government that is dramatic, like the announcement that with immediate effect there's no lending, right? Which would have been disastrous, and thankfully it was reversed within a matter of days. But this time around, you have all the rhetoric where they're saying, look, it's you people in business who are the problem, blah, blah, blah. But in terms of policy action, what we've seen happen on the ground is that the auction rate went from 1,070 to 1.4 to now where it is at roughly 1,900. So if you actually read between the lines, right, the movement on the official auction is basically an admission that, you know what, we were being unreasonable with the managed
John,
exchange rate.
would you agree to that?
I think the fundamental problem with Zimbabwe is that we don't tell each other truth. Okay, and that statement from business about hot money, I mean, what is hot money? Okay, is someone trying to say something without saying something? Okay, the question there should be very blunt. Someone is printing money. Okay, the power market rate moves. Okay, only when there's liquidity in the market. The question, therefore, is where is that liquidity coming from? Okay, there's only one source of liquidity in this country. One. It's the central bank. Correct?
Yeah.
If there's no RTGS in the system, the power market rate will not move. Likewise, the bank rate or the official rate will not move either. So what is moving the rate? What is hot money? So business is saying, guys, you're saying it's us as business, but we don't create RTGS balances. So I think government and everyone now should turn around and ask who is creating the balances. And therein lies the solution.
Okay. To be fair, the Competitions and Tariffs Commission had a look at this, and they presented to Cabinet, and then Sekai Zenza, the Minister of Industry and Commerce, had to actually present to ZANU-PF, right? And they all said, that the papers that were presented all said the same thing, which is it's printing, it's liquidity that's coming from the central bank. So, but that message seems to be everywhere but in the president's office, because the president's office, when you read his entire presentation or what he presented on Sunday, he did not talk about liquidity.
Yeah, look, I hear you, and I think this is a common theme. And as an analyst who's been following things for a couple of decades, I think it's much more important to focus on policy action versus policy statements. So it's one thing to look at what they've been saying, because for example, over the last 10 years, one of the common threads in almost every statement about exchange rates and inflation is that, stability is coming. But the action that has been taken and the reality on the ground have been different. And I think, so it's not, I don't find it particularly useful to analyze statements. Let's look at the actions, the policy actions.
Okay, fantastic. I like that. Let's look at the actions and the statements. With that, there is talk of, and we've already started seeing it, digital gold coins on the market. And the argument is the digital gold coins could be the new currency. So, yeah, this is not a statement, but these are murmurings that are coming from the central bank. I mean, it was a success as far as they're concerned. It was a success. And they're looking at digital gold coins as the new currency. And, you and I would have digital gold coins. Would have this new currency that's backed by gold, supposedly. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think that the digital gold coins could actually be a new currency and could work well?
Tinashe, I think the digital gold coins story is quite interesting in that, what are they really? I mean, okay, so what I would say, you're saying I've got currency in digital form backed by gold somewhere.
Yes.
Okay, so for that to work, I must have confidence in what you're saying, right? One of the characteristics of money, by the way, is that it has to be acceptable, firstly, right? Secondly, you should be able to easily move it around and make use of it. Can I go into a TM or an OK and buy groceries using digital coins? Will TM and OK be able to use those digital coins to buy groceries from South Africa? Will the South Africans accept the digital coin as a currency? Right? It also has to be something that you can move around.
Will Matakshop
accept the digital coin as currency? So I mean, the reality of it is the features of the digital coin that we are made aware of right now do not meet any of that criteria. So you surely can't expect that to replace the currency in the country.
Rufaro, can you switch from, because as far as I'm concerned, the digital gold coin is actually an investment asset. can we move it from being an investment asset to being a monetary currency asset?
I think you can. I think the more interesting question is, will it succeed as as a monetary?
So nothing can stop them from doing
absolutely,
it.
you can. You know,
is it going to be successful?
They could create an app that we could all download, and you know, I could move money from myself to Pick and Pay at the checkout counter, or to you, or you know, it could actually theoretically, it could actually be a functioning currency. The question is, does the issue of this digital gold coin enjoy the faith and confidence of the market? Are people going to move their hard-earned savings into this currency? You know, and I think I can answer that question categorically with high conviction that the answer is no.
Yeah, and the other thing that they often forget to discuss is, you know, the digital gold coin, because it's a proxy of gold, right? There is a bit of volatility there. It's a proxy of gold and it's a proxy of the auction rate. And as we've already seen with the auction rate, there's a lot of volatility. And retailers or matak shops don't want that volatility. They just want to trade with a stable currency. And that's why we're using US dollar. With that, where to with the Zim dollar? Do you think that this is the end of the Zim dollar, or it still has some legs?
I don't think it's anywhere near the end of the Zim dollar. It still has its uses. It's still accepted as a medium of exchange all over the country. People still use it widely in grocery shops, through eco-cash, etc., etc. So it definitely still has a long way to go. But I think if the slide continues, especially at the pace that it's done in the past 2 to 3 weeks, we'll slowly see its worthiness dwindling to close to nothing.
I think it's going to the grave. But anyway.
Your question is different. Your question has to do with the auction.
Yeah.
What do you think is going to happen with the auction? So, you know, away from the statements, but just looking at the ground, on the ground, what do you think is going to happen with the auction? As we've already established, we import $8.6 billion in a year, and the auction is substantially less than $1 billion. So it's about 10% of what we actually import.
So look, I can't speak for the brain trust that sets the rate every week. You know what they're thinking. I can only speculate and extrapolate from their previous actions. So over the last 3 weeks, the auction has moved from 1070 to where it is today at about 1,900. And to me, what that speaks to is an admission by those managing the exchange rate that the gap between the parallel market and the official market was not serving us well, that we are better off with a much smaller premium, with you know, a quasi-convergence, you know, between the parallel market and the official rate. So I think they're probably targeting 20-25%, which is where we've seen it previously, and that's, you know, that's.
So you still think that the auction serves a purpose and has its usefulness?
No, I don't. I think the auction is not an auction; it's a managed exchange rate, and I think it's the source for a lot of the issues around the currency. But I do think that it's a positive when the gap between the power market and the auction is much smaller, because at a certain you know, when the gap is at a certain level, you know, where it was previously, like at 100%, it incentivizes really bad behavior. You know, people are going to, because, you know, if you can win a bid at the auction at half the price, and then transfer price, you know, whatever you're importing, and keep, you know, half the money or more offshore, there's a huge incentive for that kind of
arbitrage profits there. So I want you, John, to speak to, you know, when we talk about the auction, the often forgotten guy is actually the exporter. Because when you think about it, the rate that Rivari is talking about, which he thinks is a movement, but unfortunately the guy who's getting the brunt of that is the exporter, because he's going to get a rate of 1 for his US dollars, which in the open market you could have got 4,000. Now he's getting 1,900, and he can't even use that. He can't even pay government taxes with that Zim dollar. What's going to happen with our exporters?
Well, like what Rufaro has already alluded to, there's going to be a lot of transfer pricing, certainly. Try and preserve value out there before it comes back. That will definitely increase. Okay. And or reduce the amount of exports that one does. Because really, what are you doing?
Yeah, and I think that's a very important point, because we're already starting to see it this year in 2023 that the level and the volumes of exports have actually started to reduce, at least certainly for the first quarter. Yeah. So that's a big worry. So finally, just to wrap things up, what I want us to talk about is, currency board is something that I'm passionate about, and I think that is something that can solve this problem or the quagmire that we have currently. It doesn't solve the underlying problem of us spending more than we receive as
it actually solves
revenues.
That, but
no, there's a gap. So we're spending about $7 billion. When we do our calculations, we're spending about $7 billion, but our entire revenue is about $3.5 billion.
I hear you, but you see,
how do you solve that?
See, if you have a currency board, right, which is similar to if you just outright move to using the US dollar or rand or pula or whatever.
Yeah.
If you move to a scenario where you can't print, right, you literally can't spend money that you don't have. So if we adopted a currency board, it would enforce discipline in the fiscal space, because even if the intention was to spend more than we were collecting in revenue, we wouldn't physically be able to.
No, that's true. But how do you tell the politicians that they cannot feed 3.8 or 3.5 million households with Fumvudza seeds and all those subsidies? How do you tell the politicians that you can't do that anymore? That Zuko has to go.
Well, that's not a winning argument. I see. So.
No, I'm just trying to ask you, how are you going to convince the politician who, for the last 5 years, has been distributing Fumvudza inputs, which now, we hear from the Ministry of Agriculture, they're distributing this to 3.5 million households. So how do you suddenly tell them? Because once you have a currency board, once you institute fiscal discipline, you cannot have Fumvudza.
No, so I think actually when we had the episode where we dove deep into the currency board, I think we had a guest, his name is
Jimmy Silas,
Yeah, Jimmy Silas. And he actually made a compelling case to the politicians. He says, look, if you have a currency board, right, you can restructure debt, you can raise money, you can do all these fantastic things that you can't do when you're handicapped by a dysfunctional currency, by debt arrears. And all of these things that you're speaking to that are important to the politicians, there's a way that they can be funded in an environment with a currency board, because you then have this fiscal space, because you're no longer in arrears, because you can raise money, because you can fund things differently. And you can even partner with the private sector and say, listen, guys, can you participate in these projects and solve some of these problems?
Yeah, certainly.
But you can't have that conversation.
The local credit market would actually grow.
But you can't have that conversation in the current with the current state of affairs.
John, if you were talking to the politicians and you say that, we have to do away with Fumvudza in its current form, but we will create the space, private sector will grow, and you'll be able to support it, but in a fiscally disciplined way. Do you see that as a possibility, convincing the politicians who must win elections? And just as a preamble, we had Professor Gift Mugano the one time, I don't know if you watched the show, but he said something that has stuck with me for a while. And he said that actually electioneering doesn't begin before the election. It actually begins after the election for the next 5 years. And we've seen Fumvudza for the last 5 years. That's actually election spending. So how do we get our guys to realize that Fumvudza has to go?
Okay. There are two things that I think are important. Number one, we need to compute how much is actually spent on those programs.
About $3.5 billion a year.
In comparison to everything else that's happening.
Okay.
So how much is actually being used for fiscal activities, right? You'll find that there's probably a lot more of this money being used for things that are not
corruption,
essential to anything.
You said we must be direct. You know, the one time she was accusing business of not being direct.
No, so that's what you want to call it. But
let's call it corruption. Okay.
So I don't think
so you're saying
it's fair to
it's less to do with Mvudza.
Yeah. Secondly, I'm a typical example of the second thing, which is you should allow the private sector to be involved in some of these fiscal activities. Right? By allowing us to create that commodity fund, what government essentially has done is taken the burden away from GMB to provide liquidity and involving the private sector into post-harvest activities, which is a huge step. Okay, I think in the same respect, other players in the private sector can step in with the Mvudzas and stuff like that because it's within their interest. Seedco can come in and, you know, sponsor a grower scheme. So how much is actually being used to get votes versus how much is actually being used is a big question. Secondly, involve the private sector a lot more in what you're doing.
Gotcha. Okay, that's a good point. Rufaro, why is it, so if we really think about corruption, a word that our good friend JB does not want to use, but, you know, we are very comfortable in using it. If you look at corruption, yes, Zimbabwe is corrupt, and it's high up there, certainly from what we watched with the gold mafia, that's very clear. But when you look at Malawi, you look at Mozambique, you look at Kenya, those are also corrupt countries, but they don't suffer from hyperinflation. So why can't we bring in the same sort of discipline, relatively, that Uganda, which is a dictatorship, but they are fiscally responsible? Why can't we have that? Why can't we be fiscally responsible, corrupt, but the economy growing? Not that I support corruption. I'm not.
Yeah, no. Look, I get the point that you're making, and
corruption
I think,
is everywhere.
Yeah,
but hyperinflation.
So this is, you know, a recurring theme, right? Which is, yes, we have corruption as an issue in this part of the world, but there are, you know, places that have equally bad or worse corruption, but they're moving along because their financial houses are in order. And I think one of the biggest shortcomings of the business community in Zimbabwe is failing to sell this idea, which I think is very valid, that a growing, thriving economy is not inimical to the interests of the politicians of the day. In fact, the politicians of the day will do so much better in an economy that is growing and thriving.
A rising tide
lifts all boats. Yeah. So and you know, so often we are seen in the business community of being critical, of being even opposed to the politicians. But actually, we have a common interest. We want, for business people, you know, we want to make more money, right? And we shouldn't be apologetic about that. But making more money is actually in the national interest because it grows the economy.
But that's what the president is actually saying.
It creates jobs, and it makes the politicians look good, right? So we should really have a much better engagement with the government of the day and sell this idea to them that we can thrive together, right? Notwithstanding our disagreements, you know, about politics or corruption or these other things, but, you know, why not focus on the areas where we can have a common vision?
Bring in stability. John, you can have the last word.
If I can just maybe fortify what Rufaro said, I came across a very interesting concept the other day. It's an index they call the misery index. Okay. Now the misery index, exactly. It's basically a measurement of how happy nations are or miserable they are. Okay. So it's basically you add the inflation rate, the unemployment rate, and bank lending rates, and you subtract the positive, which is your growth in GDP. Okay. Out of 152 countries, Zimbabwe ranks number 1 in terms of misery. We're the most miserable nation in the world. Okay. So I think from a very simple perspective, to just buttress what Rufaro said, maybe we need to look at those 3 or 4 factors alone and say, how do we reduce the misery in the country? How do we sort out unemployment? Okay, what's causing the inflation? Okay, what's the issue around monetary policy and interest rates? Okay, and how does that feed into an increase in GDP? Simple things, nothing complicated, And that explains why the Ugandas and the other corrupt nations in this world are not at number one out of 152 nations.
And also sanctioned. I mean, Russia is a sanctioned country, but it's managing its economy relatively well. So I think on that note, thank you very much. Steve Hankey also suggests that our inflation rate is actually over 700%. And that, I think, speaks to why prices are going up as much as they are, although the blended rate is at 72%. So the disparity is quite glaring. But there you have it. Thank you very much for joining us. I think this was a very enlightened, and I certainly gained from it. And we hope to see more of you.
Thank you. Thanks, guys.
Yeah. We like the Africa Day outfit. Yeah.
Yeah, we have to honor who we are.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Have yourself a wonderful weekend, and please keep the comments coming and let us know what you think, and who you would want us to have on the next show and which topics you want us to discuss. Otherwise, cheerio.
Cheers.